Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Sunday, Yom Rishon. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Yehudit in South Carolina, Melissa in New York, Carla in Brazil, Lucy in Minnesota, Sharon in New Jersey, Shandora in the Bronx, Joe in the Inland Empire, Paul in Minneapolis, and John in Scotland, Bill in mid-Missouri, Sandy wishing everyone a good evening, Belle in Texas, Alyssa in Philadelphia, Marjorie wishing shalom, and Rochelle in Modesto. Welcome everybody. Our daf is page 21 here in chapter 1 of Tractate Kiddushin, the 20th volume of the Talmud. We are continuing our discussion of Mishna number 2 here in chapter 1. Generally speaking, the tractate is about betrothal and how betrothal is put into effect, how it is created, because the language of the Torah is that the man acquires a woman, and that in betrothal, and that the way to do that is through money or an object that is worth money or a document or intercourse. Now that we've used this language of acquisition and we're learning out certain laws from the laws of betrothal to the laws of slavery as it was practiced in the ancient world when slavery existed, in the Jewish world. And also comparing Hebrew slaves and Canaanite slaves. Okay, we continue on page 21a, a couple of lines from the top. And the Gemara provides a mnemonic device for the names of sages who raise the dilemmas cited below and those to whom these questions are addressed. And if you were memorizing the whole Talmud, it would be very helpful to know that Cheresh, Chavash, and Zeman can help us know the names of the sages. What I think will be more helpful for us, because today we're sort of making comparison by analogy and seeing if laws can be extended and interpreted from one realm to another, between redeeming the slave, right? So a slave who is forced into servitude because he stole and he cannot pay it back, or he sold himself into slavery. Can he purchase himself back before his term is up? So we're going to be learning out certain laws and principles from the laws of redeeming real property, either because you sold it and you want to get it back, or because you consecrated it to the temple and you might want to get it back. So there's a nice note here that summarizes these laws about selling and redeeming real property, or consecrating and redeeming real property. Nice succinct explanation from Rav Steinsaltz. The special laws of selling and consecrating real estate are discussed in the Torah, in verses Leviticus 25, verses 25 through 33, Leviticus 27, verses 16 through 25. And the basic laws are as follows. If one sells his ancestral land and it is not redeemed, it returns to him in the Jubilee year, right? The Jubilee year would come every 50 years. So if you sell an ancestral field, right, meaning the land as it was divvied up among the families and tribes of Israel when the children of Israel entered the promised land. So you can't really sell that land out of your family. You can only sell it for the number of years remaining until the next Jubilee year, and then it returns to your family. Now, relatives can redeem this land, meaning sooner than when the Jubilee year comes. It cannot be redeemed within 2 years of its sale, not in the first 2 years. And it cannot be redeemed unless one actually has the money to do so. Therefore, one cannot borrow money to redeem the land, and furthermore, one cannot redeem part of it, right? That's called partial redemption. If one sells a house in a walled city, so the laws of property within walled cities are going to be different than ancestral fields. If one sells a house in a walled city, he can redeem it immediately. If he does not redeem it within a year, the house belongs to the purchaser forever, right? So you have a cool down period type of thing. You sold it when you were emotional. You have a year to buy it back. For a house in a walled city in the land of Israel. If the year passes and you didn't buy it back, now it's a permanent sale. You never get it back unless that buyer wants to sell it back to you, but you have no right to get it back. No inherent right? He doesn't have to sell it back to you. Where am I? And it does not revert to the original. Wait a minute. So if one sells a house in a walled city, he can redeem it immediately. If he does not redeem it within a year, the house belongs to the purchaser forever. And it does not revert to the original owner in the Jubilee year. A house cannot be redeemed by relatives, and one cannot borrow money to redeem it, nor can one partially redeem it. Houses in villages or fields, meaning anywhere that is not surrounded by a wall, they are treated like ancestral land. It doesn't have to actually be a farm field. It just needs to be land outside of the walled cities. In which case they're treated like ancestral land, with the exception that they can be redeemed immediately. Now, the same law applies to houses of Levites and priests, even if they are in walled cities. Now, one who consecrates his ancestral land can redeem it immediately. Now, consecrate means you donate that land to the temple, right? Consecrate means you turn it over for holy purposes. Quite different than selling. You're going to lose the use of it, but you didn't do this for money. You do it as an offering, to the Lord. You're giving it to the temple treasury. So one who consecrates his ancestral land, he can redeem it immediately. One may borrow money to redeem it, and one may partially redeem it. If the field that was consecrated was not redeemed before the Jubilee year, it does not return to its owners, and instead it becomes the property of the priests. If the son of one who consecrated a field redeems it, he is considered like his father with regard to the return of the field in the Jubilee year. In the case of one who consecrates a house in a walled city, he can redeem it immediately. If another person purchased a house from the temple treasurer, it is treated like any other case involving one who purchases a house in a walled city. Meaning, if it is not redeemed within a year, it does not return to its owners. Finally, one who consecrates a house outside a walled city can redeem it at any time. It returns to its owner in the Jubilee year, even if another person had acquired it from the temple treasury in the meantime. Don't feel bad if you didn't memorize all of that as I read it. That's just to give us some passing familiarity with these laws about buying and selling real property, differentiating between fields outside of the cities and houses within the walled cities, and distinguishing between selling real property and consecrating it, giving it as a gift to the Kohanim who run the temple. Okay. And we're learning out those laws. We're going to, deal with those laws because we're making comparisons to the redemption of Hebrew slaves who normally served for 6 years and redemption of Canaanite slaves who normally were enslaved forever. All right. So Rav Acha, the son of Rava, said to Rav Ashi, the comparison detailed earlier on page 20b between one who sells a house and one who consecrates a field can be refuted. We can't make that comparison because these cases are different. Why? What is unique about one who sells a house among the houses of walled cities is that his power is diminished in that he is not able to redeem it forever, since he cannot redeem it after a year has passed. Shall you say the same with regard to one who consecrates his field, as his power is enhanced in that he is able to redeem it forever? Rav Acha Sava said to Rav Ashi, the comparison is valid because it can be said that the argument returns, as one can learn in a different manner. Let this matter be derived by analogy derived from the common factor of two sources. The law of one who sells an ancestral field can prove it, as his power is enhanced in that he is able to redeem the field forever, and he cannot borrow money and redeem it, and he cannot partially redeem it. And if you say what is unique about one who sells an ancestral field is that his power is diminished in that he is not able to redeem it immediately, the case of one who sells a house from among the houses of walled cities can prove otherwise. Although one can redeem the house immediately, he cannot borrow money and redeem it, nor partially redeem it. Right? They're saying it's difficult to learn out from one area of the law to another because these areas of the law have unique features. And since they are unique, it might not be correct to make an interpretation where we extend what seems to be seems to be a similar area of law and therefore should have similar outcomes, but it's not similar because it has distinct features. And the derivation has reverted to its starting point, as one could alternate the explanations for each side with their respective refutations. Ultimately, the aspect of this case, the ancestral field, is not like the aspect of that case, a house from among the houses of walled cities. Their common denominator is that they can be redeemed, and one cannot borrow money and redeem them, and likewise one cannot partially redeem them. I will also bring the case of one who consecrates his field and rule that it may be redeemed, but one cannot borrow money and redeem it, and one cannot partially redeem it. Mar Zutra, the son of Rav Mari, said to Ravina, this derivation, based on the common denominator, can be refuted. What is unique to their common denominator is that their power is diminished in that they are unable to redeem their respective properties during the second year, as in neither case can they be redeemed in the second year. One who sells a house in a walled city cannot redeem it beyond the first year, while one who sells an ancestral field cannot redeem it during the first 2 years. Shall you say the same with regard to one who consecrated his field, as his power is enhanced in that he is able to redeem the field in the second year? Ravina said to him that the derivation is valid because it can be said that the case of a Hebrew slave sold to a Gentile can prove otherwise, as his power is enhanced in that he is able to redeem himself in the second year, and nevertheless he cannot borrow money and redeem himself, and he cannot partially redeem himself. The Gemara discusses a similar matter. Rav Huna bar Chinana raised a dilemma before Rav Sheshes. In the case of one who sells a house from among the houses of walled cities, can it be redeemed by relatives or can it not be redeemed by relatives? Is the ability to redeem a house limited to the seller himself? So the Gemara presents the two sides of the dilemma. Does one derive the verbal analogy of geulato and geulato from an ancestral field in this, like this? Just as an ancestral field cannot be partially redeemed and yet it can be redeemed by relatives, so too this house also cannot be partially redeemed and yet it can be redeemed by relatives. Or perhaps when the word geula is written in the case of an ancestral field, it is written with regard to the partial redemption. But the word redemption is not written with regard to whether relatives can make that do the redeeming. If so, the verbal analogy does not apply to the law of redemption by relatives. So Rav Sheshes said to him, the house cannot be redeemed by relatives. Rav Huna bar Chinana raised an objection to the ruling of Rav Sheshes from a Baraisa that deals with the verse, and in all of your ancestral land you shall grant redemption for the land. Leviticus 25:24. This verse serves to include houses and a Hebrew slave. Now what, is it not correct to say that the term houses is referring to houses in walled cities, indicating that they can also be redeemed by relatives? So the Gemara rejects this suggestion. No, this is referring to houses in open areas without walls. So the Gemara asks, with regard to houses in open areas without walls, houses outside of walled cities are treated like ancestral fields, as we saw. It is explicitly written, such houses in open areas shall be reckoned with the field of the country, meaning that they are like ancestral fields. If so, there is no need for another verse to teach this law. And the Gemara answers that verse, and in all of your ancestral land you shall grant redemption for the land. This serves to establish that redemption by relatives is an obligation. And this is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, as it is taught in a Baraisa with regard to the verse that deals with one who sells ancestral land, and he shall redeem that which his brother has sold. So then the redemption is optional, i.e., if he wishes to do so, he may redeem the land, but it's not that he must. Do you say that it is optional, or is it nothing other than an obligation? I mean, are you saying it's optional, or is it an obligation? The verse states concerning an ancestral field that was sold, quote, and if a man has no one to redeem it, Leviticus 25:26. This verse is puzzling, but is there a man in Israel who does not have redeemers? Every Jew has a relative of some sort, even if he must trace his family tree back all the way to our father Jacob. Rather, this is referring to one who has a relative who does not want to purchase, i.e. to redeem the land, as he has permission to refrain from doing so, since this redemption is optional. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehoshua. Rabbi Eliezer says that when the verse states, and he shall redeem that which his brother has sold, this redemption is an obligation. Do you say that it is an obligation, or is it only optional? The verse states, and in all your ancestral land, you shall grant redemption for the land. Here the verse established it as obligatory. This interpretation of the verses is according to Rabbi Eliezer. The sages said to Rav Ashi, and some say Ravina said to Rav Ashi, granted, according to the one who says that the verse serves to include houses of walled cities, this is as it is written, quote, in all. So the words in all serves to include a case omitted by the phrase, you shall grant a redemption for the land. But according to the one who says that it serves to include houses in open areas without walls, what is meant by the term in all? It was already taught that these houses are included in the category of ancestral fields, and therefore they are referred to by the expression redemption for the land. No answer was found to this question, and so the Gemara states that it is a difficulty. Abaye raised an objection to this opinion that houses in walled cities cannot be redeemed by relatives. It is taught in a Baraisa. What does it mean when the verse states, may redeem him, and may redeem him? 3 times in Leviticus 25, verses 48 to 49. 3 times. This serves to include all redemptions, and they are redeemed in this order. In the case of a Hebrew slave sold to a Gentile, if he does not redeem himself, he can be redeemed by his brother. If he is not redeemed by a brother, then he can be redeemed by an uncle or some other relative. What, is it not correct to say that this inclusion is referring to houses of walled cities and a Hebrew slave, that they too can be redeemed by relatives? And the Gemara rejects this interpretation. No, it includes houses in open areas and an ancestral field. So the Gemara asks, but the cases of houses in open areas and the case of an ancestral field are written explicitly. Shall be reckoned with the field of the country in Leviticus 25:31. So the Gemara answers, this is as Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, that the verse detailing the redemption by relatives as stated with regard to an ancestral field teaches that the closer of a relative one is to the seller, the earlier one is in the order of redeeming the ancestral field. So the obligation or merit to redeem the field applies first to the one who is more closely related to the seller. So too, with regard to houses in open areas, this verse teaches that the closer of a relative one is to the seller, the earlier one is in the order of having the opportunity to receive the merit for redeeming that property back into the family. So the Gemara asks, what was the opinion of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak originally stated? The Gemara answers that it was stated with regard to this issue. A dilemma was raised before the sages. Can a Hebrew slave sold to a Jew be redeemed by his relatives, or can he not be redeemed by his relatives? Now we understand why we're talking about all these laws of redeeming property. The Gemara comments, according to the opinion of Rebbe, you should not raise this dilemma. As he says, one who is not redeemed by these relatives is redeemed by 6 years of service. Evidently, Rebbe holds that a Hebrew slave sold to a Gentile cannot be redeemed by his relatives, that this only applies to redeeming a Hebrew slave sold to a Hebrew master. So when you raise the dilemma, it is according to the opinion of the rabbis who disagree with Rebbe. What is the law? Does one derive the verbal analogy comparing the word hired worker in Leviticus 25:40 to the word hired worker in Leviticus 25:53 from the case of a Jew sold to a Gentile, and say that just as one can be redeemed by one's relatives if he is sold to a Gentile, so too one can be redeemed by his relatives if sold to a Jew? And at the same time, one does not interpret homiletically the phrase may redeem him from Leviticus 25:48 stated with regard to one sold to a Gentile as a restricting term. Or perhaps the phrase may redeem him is in fact a restricting term, which indicates that this law applies only to this slave, i.e. only to one sold to a Gentile, he can be redeemed by relatives, and it does not apply to another slave, meaning the one sold to a Jew. So come in here a baraisa to answer this dilemma. Quote, and in all of your ancestral land, you shall grant redemption for the land. Leviticus 25:24. And this inclusive expression, in all, right, in all of your ancestral land, in all serves to include houses and a Hebrew slave. So what? Is it not correct to say that this includes houses of walled cities and the Hebrew slave sold to a Jew? And the Gemara rejects this interpretation. No, one can say that this is referring only to a Hebrew slave who is sold to a Gentile. So the Gemara asks, it is explicitly written with regard to a Hebrew slave sold to a Gentile. Either his uncle or his uncle's son may redeem him. If so, since it says it explicitly in the Torah, why would we need to derive that law from an interpretation of another law? It must be that if an interpretation is available in that other law, it's teaching something that was not explicitly stated in the Torah. Right? So the Gemara says it is explicitly written with regard to a Hebrew slave sold to a Gentile. Either his uncle or his uncle's son may redeem him. If so, it is unnecessary to derive the option of redemption by a relative from an inclusive expression in a different verse. So the Gemara answers at the top of 21b. That verse serves to establish that redeeming him is an obligation, not just an option. And even according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua, who says that there is no requirement to redeem land, this case is different, as it is proper to redeem him to prevent him from becoming assimilated into the Gentiles. Come in here a different proof from a baraisa. What is the meaning when the verse states, may redeem him, and may redeem him 3 times in Leviticus 25, verses 48-49? This serves to include all redemptions. Ancestral fields, houses in walled cities, Jews sold as slaves to other Jews, and Jews sold as slaves to other Gentiles. Is that what we're saying? What? Is it not correct to say that this inclusion is referring both to houses of walled cities and a Hebrew slave sold to a Jew, that they can be redeemed by relatives? The Gemara says, no! It includes houses in open areas and an ancestral field. The Gemara asks, concerning houses in open areas and an ancestral field, it is written explicitly, shall be reckoned with the field of the country. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, this teaches that the closer of a relative one is to the seller, the earlier one is in the order of redeeming the house or the field. This is the context of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak's statement. Let's leave this incredibly complicated derivation behind somewhat. The Gemara returns to our Mishna, Mishna number 2 here in chapter 1, which teaches, and a Hebrew slave who is pierced after serving 6 years is acquired as a slave for a longer period through piercing his ear with an awl, right? A-W-L, an awl, right? So we're talking now about the Jew who was sold into slavery by the court, or the Jew who sold himself into slavery because he couldn't pay his debts, he was just too poor. In both cases, he's sold to a Jew. And this is indentured servitude, meaning he's like a slave, but it ends after 6 years. However, the Torah provides that there is a mechanism where this slave can remain within his master's house as a slave by his own, the slave's own choice, because it's better for him in that master's house. And now we're going to learn how that's done and severe limitations on that. Because as we've seen over and over again, while the Gemara will spend a lot of time in now analyzing in micro detail, what's possible, what's not, what's the redemption price, who does the redeeming, etc. This is not to say that we like slavery. Not the Torah does not like slavery, God does not like slavery, the sages do not like slavery, the Jewish people do not like slavery. It is a disgrace to be a slave. It is a disgrace to own a slave. It's bad all around, and it was even then, which was such a unbelievable thing to say in the ancient world when slavery was just, like it was as common as bread and water. It's just everywhere. Okay, So how are we going to limit this? So now let's talk about this slave who wants to remain a slave. This is a very negative thing, because one who is free, a Jew who is free, right, is free to love God, is free. I mean, a slave can do that too, but he is free to show his love for God by performing all the mitzvahs that are incumbent on a Jew to perform. And a slave who is not the master of his own time is not free to serve God in that way. A Jew should only have one master, God. But this Jewish slave owned by a Jew has two masters, right? God and the Jew who owns him. So it's very problematic. Okay, maybe it was necessary. Some people were so poor that their choice was starve or sell themselves. Or there was the thief who stole and can't afford to pay back what he stole, and so the court sells him into slavery. Okay, he's going to do that for 6 years. We don't want that to go on. We don't want him to have this option. It's interesting that the Torah provides even the possibility of it, but now we're going to limit. So his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, right? An awl is like a metal, sort of like a pen-shaped piece of metal with a point, and that you use it with a hammer to drive a hole in an object. In this case, a person's ear. Let's see. So the Mishnah further teaches that a pierced slave, right, one who says, I will remain with my master because I love my master and it is better for me to stay here. He's not going to remain that master's slave forever. It's only going to be until the master dies or until the Jubilee year comes. So the Mishnah further teaches that a pierced slave acquires himself, meaning he goes free, through the advent of the Jubilee year and through the master's death. And the Gemara explains that this is as it is written. Quote, and he shall serve him forever. Sounds like forever, not until the Jubilee year or until his master dies. It says forever, but the term indicates that he serves only the master, but not the son or the daughter of the master. He does not become inheritable property. The term forever is referring to the forever represented by the Jubilee year. That's a big limitation on forever, at most 50 years. And if he was acquired somewhere in the middle of that, 50-year cycle, it could be 25 years, could be 10 years, could be much, much less. Right? So the word forever does not mean for eternity, but refers to the end of the cycle of the Jubilee year. The sages taught. So from the term awl that is used, right, the A-W-L, the awl that is used to pierce the slave's ear, from this term, I have derived only that a master can pierce the ear of a Hebrew slave with an awl. From where do I derive that a sharp thorn, or a needle, or an auger, or a stylus that is used to engrave wax, that any of these tools may be used to pierce the slave's ear? The verse states, and you shall take the awl. And this term, and you shall take, serves to include any implement that can be taken in the master's hand. This is the statement of Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Yehuda. Right? So Rabbi Yosef is saying the Torah said an awl to explain the kind of hole you're going to make, but you can make that hole by piercing the slave's ear with some other tool, any tool that you can use in your hand for that purpose. Rebbe says, no, not all of these utensils may be used for piercing the slave's ear. Just as an awl is unique in that it is made of metal, so too any tool made of metal can be used. But one may not pierce a slave's ear with a non-metal implement. Alternatively, the verse states, and you shall take the awl, to include the large awl for piercing. Like there was talk to any guy with a garage full of tools and he'll tell you, any person, let me not be sexist in any way, but talk to any person with a garage full of tools and they'll tell you, there's a tool for the job. There's a specific tool for every job. Okay, so there's a specific awl for piercing the slave's ear, and that's the awl that we're going to use. Rabbi Elazar said, Yudan the distinguished would teach as follows. When they pierce only the earlobe. And the rabbis say the piercing is not performed on the earlobe. Can you see why? Right? So this is the earlobe. We're quite accustomed, even now, thousands of years later, to see people with pierced ears who have earrings right here. Right? That's the earlobe. But now the sages are saying, no, you cannot. You cannot do that. The piercing of the slave with the awl, the slave who wants to remain a slave and be marked that way, It shouldn't be in the earlobe. It should be up here in the cartilage, a different spot. Why? Very interesting. And the rabbis say the piercing is not performed on the earlobe, as the law is that a Hebrew slave who is a priest is not pierced at all. A priest is not, if a priest becomes a slave, and then he wants to stay with his master as a slave, we don't pierce his ear. Why? Very interesting. Because the piercing is not in the earlobe. You see, if the piercing was in the earlobe, there would be no problem piercing the ear of a priest just like anybody else, because a pierced earlobe is not considered a blemish on the body. It is not considered a blemish on the body. However, we say that we don't pierce a priest's ear because it would create a blemish such that when he finally leaves slavery, he will no longer be able to serve as a priest in the temple because his body has become blemished. But if he has a pierced earlobe, that's not a blemish. So it must be that the piercing of a pierced slave is up here, where it would create a blemish if it were done to a priest, such that he would be disqualified from serving in the temple. So you see, from the fact that the sages have ruled that we don't pierce the ear of a priest because he will become blemished, that's how we know that the piercing has to be up here and not down here, which is not considered a blemish. Right? The piercing is not performed on the earlobe, as the law is that a Hebrew slave who is a priest is not pierced at all, because the piercing renders him blemished and unfit to serve in the temple. And if you say that they pierce a slave's earlobe, how does a Hebrew slave who is a priest become blemished through piercing? A pierced earlobe is not considered a blemish. This indicates that he is pierced only in the upper part of the ear through the cartilage. And the Gemara inquires, with regard to what principle do Rebbe and Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, disagree? And the Gemara explains, Rebbe expounds the verses by means of the hermeneutical principle of reading the verses consisting of generalizations and details. So accordingly, he maintains that the term, and you shall take, with regard to this awl, the tool used for piercing, he reads that as a generalization that indicates piercing may be performed with any implement, and an awl is a detail. And when the verse states through his ear and into the door, it then generalized again. So when the verse writes a generalization followed by a detail followed by a generalization, you may deduce, following the hermeneutical principles that the sages used to derive laws that were not explicitly written in the Torah, from this sequence, generalization, detail, generalization, you may deduce that the verse is referring only to items similar to the detail. Just as the explicit detail mentions an awl, which is made of metal, so too any utensil used for piercing must be made of metal. That's how Rebbe derives it. By contrast, Rabbi Yosef expounds the verse by means of a different hermeneutical principle. He is reading it he's seeing this verse as a series of amplifications and restrictions rather than generalizations and details. And this produces a different result. Accordingly, he learns that the term, and you shall take, amplifies, i.e. it includes any item that can be taken in one's hand. The term all and all restricts. So when the verse states through his ear and into the door, it then amplifies again. So when a verse amplifies, restricts, and amplifies, it has amplified the law to include everything except one item. Right? That's a totally different outcome. Generalization, detail, generalization means that everything everything in the generalization must be like the detail. Amplification, restriction, amplification means that the verse has come to include everything that's possible except for one item. So what has it amplified, i.e. included beyond an all, and has amplified the category to include everything that can pierce an ear? What has it restricted from inclusion in the category? It excludes only the method that is most dissimilar to the use of an awl, which is a corrosive substance. Producing a hole in the slave's ear with a substance of this kind is not a valid form of piercing. I mean, I think he's saying like you can't drip acid in the ear to create a hole. but any other way of piercing the ear would be valid. That's how Rabbi Yosef would read it. Rebbe would say, no, it has to be a metal implement like the awl. Now, the master said above, the awl. This serves to include the large awl for piercing. So the Gemara asks, from where may it be inferred that this expression is referring to a large awl? And the Gemara answers that this is, as Rava said with regard to the verse, the sinew of the thigh vein, which is upon the hollow of the thigh, in Genesis 32:33, that this is referring to the most important part of the thigh. Likewise, here, the definite article, meaning the awl, as opposed to an awl. So the definite article, the, indicates something clear and obvious. So here, too, the term the awl is referring to a special awl made for piercing ears. It was further stated in the above Baraisa that Rabbi Elazar said, Yudan the distinguished would teach, when they pierce a slave, they pierce only the earlobe. And the rabbis say a Hebrew slave who is a priest is not pierced at all because piercing renders him blemished. And the Gemara asks, and let him be pierced and be rendered blemished and disqualified for temple service. Why is it prohibited to do this? Why should we care about this priest, that he's going to be unfit to serve in the temple after he finishes his servitude? He was brought low. Maybe the fact that he served as a slave, maybe that should disqualify him forever for serving in the temple anyway. What do we care that he's going to be blemished? As a matter of fact, he himself is saying it's better. Why is he being pierced? Because he asked to be pierced. Why did he ask to be pierced? Because he wants to remain enslaved to his master. So he obviously doesn't care about returning to the temple and serving in the temple. So why should we care? Right, so the Gemara asks, and let him be pierced and be rendered blemished and disqualified for temple service. Why is it prohibited to do this? Rabba bar Rav Shela says the verse states concerning a Hebrew slave at the end of his servitude, quote, and he shall return to his own family, Leviticus 25:41, i.e., to his status in his family. He must be able to return to the position he had as a member of his family. If he was rendered a blemished priest while enslaved, once he is emancipated, he can no longer return to his status as a priest who can perform the temple service. And this would seemingly violate what the Torah says when it says return to his family, meaning return to his family as he was before. Right? Some other person who's pierced up here, it doesn't matter. He can return to his family, and the fact that he has a hole in his ear is not going to change anything. But a priest with that hole cannot serve in the temple. So you can't do that. So that's why the majority, the rabbis say, a priest, we don't pierce him at all. Now, does that mean that he cannot remain with his master, or that he remains with his master, but we don't do the piercing? That has not been clarified. A dilemma was raised before the sages with regard to a Hebrew slave who was a priest. What is the law concerning the permissibility for his master to provide him with a Canaanite maidservant with whom to engage in sexual intercourse? Now, we saw yesterday this very surprising law that a Jew who ends up becoming enslaved, right, either because he stole and he can't repay, or he's so poor that he feels he has no other choice. So if he was married when he entered slavery, then while he's a slave, his master can essentially breed him, right, match him with a Canaanite maidservant, a Canaanite female slave, and the children that this Canaanite female slave produces are Canaanite slaves. And it's because this Jewish slave might fall in love with that Canaanite female slave while they're both enslaved to the same master, that he might want to, at the end of his servitude, say, you know what, I'd rather stay with her, pierce my ear, and I'll remain in this household. I eat well, I'm comfortable, I like it here, it's not so bad. I'd rather stay here, right? So we only allow him to have that Canaanite, woman for creating children if he was married when he came into this slavery. Why? Because if he has a wife waiting for him, he's much less likely to say, I want to stay with this Canaanite woman as a slave. He's going to want to return to his family. If he didn't have a family, and that's why we allow him to breed with her, as it were. If he doesn't have a family outside when he becomes enslaved, then we don't allow the master to breed him to the Canaanite female slave, because then he might well fall in love with her and want to stay with her and become this, disgraceful counterexample of the Jew who wants to remain enslaved. We want to discourage that. Okay, so So now, with regard to the priest, right, the Jew who is a priest, a Cohen, who ends up enslaved, either because he stole or he sold himself into slavery, do we allow him to be used as a breeding male, to be matched with the Canaanite female slave to produce more slaves? Do we allow this? And the Gemara analyzes the two sides of the dilemma. Does one say that the law permitting a Hebrew slave to engage in intercourse with a Canaanite maidservant is a halachic novelty, as a Jew is generally prohibited from engaging in intercourse with a Gentile, and in light of this novelty, there's only two situations, right, where a Jewish man is allowed to have intercourse with a non-Jewish woman. One is when he becomes a slave and he's matched with this Canaanite maidservant, and the other is when he's, going to war, and there's the beautiful woman who is taken captive, and he can essentially bring her back to his house and go through all kinds of procedures of cooling down from the heat of battle, and then eventually take her as a wife, right? So that's the two possibilities. Other than that, right, and neither one of those situations exist anymore, and therefore, Jews are not allowed to sleep with non-Jews. Okay, so where are we? So are we going to allow, so we know that the regular Jew who becomes a slave can be matched with this Canaanite maidservant. But what about a priest? Are we going to allow this for a priest? So, the two sides of the dilemma. Do we say that this law permitting a Hebrew slave to engage in intercourse with a Canaanite maidservant, this is a halakhic novelty, since Jews are generally prohibited from engaging in intercourse with a Gentile, and in light of the fact that this is a one-off type of situation, it is no different in the case of priests and no different in the case of an Israelite. It's a unique case. So it's going to apply to priests the same as it does to other Jews. If they become slaves, they can be bred to the Canaanite maidservant. Doesn't matter whether he's a priest or not. It's a unique situation. We don't have to worry about this happening very often. Or perhaps the case of priests is different from Israelites, because the Torah includes additional commandments for priests, which do not apply to other Jews. Therefore, it is prohibited for a priest to engage in sexual intercourse with a Canaanite maidservant, despite the fact that she is permitted to a non-priest. Now, the Amoraim, the rabbis of the Gemara, disagreed with regard to this issue. Rav said it is permitted for the master to provide him with a Canaanite maidservant, and Shmuel said it is prohibited. Obviously, it's a difficult question. It's not easy for us to solve. Even Rav and Shmuel couldn't figure it out. They couldn't come to agreement. They argued about it. Rav Nachman said to Rav Anan, and I'm going to have to go pretty soon, so we're not going to, I apologize right now. There's not going to be time for questions or comments at the end, because Nina and I have to rush off to a fundraiser for our synagogue, and we have to get there on time for various reasons. Okay, where am I? So Rav Nachman said to Rav Anan, when you were studying in the house of Mar Shmuel, did you play with tokens? Meaning, did you take your studies seriously? What is the reason that you do not say a proof to him from that which we learned? And the rabbis say, a Hebrew slave who is a priest is not pierced at all, because piercing renders him blemished. And so Rav Nachman explains how this bears on whether he can be bred to a Canaanite maidservant. And if you say that if his master cannot provide him with a Canaanite maidservant, it is not even relevant to suggest that a slave of priestly lineage could be pierced, as the fact that he cannot be pierced could be derived from another point, as I require the slave to say, if he wants to be pierced, right, the Torah demands that he say, I love my master, I love my wife, and my children, right, the children he had with the Canaanite maidservant. And that declaration cannot be issued by a priest if his master may not provide him with a Canaanite maidservant. And nothing more can be answered to this proof. The reason given by the rabbis proves that a Canaanite maidservant can be provided even to a priest, and that in fact is the law. Similarly, a dilemma was raised before them. What is the law with regard to the permissibility for a priest who goes to war to engage in intercourse with a beautiful woman captured in that war? Does one say that the case of a beautiful woman is a novelty and that the Torah permits a man to engage in intercourse with a Gentile woman? Consequently, it is no different in the case of a priest and no different in the case of an Israelite. As both are permitted to engage in intercourse with this woman. Or perhaps the case of priests is different, since the Torah includes additional commandments for priests. Rav said it is permitted, and Shmuel said it is prohibited. And the Gemara comments with regard to the first act of sexual intercourse between the soldier priest and the Gentile woman, everyone agrees that it is permitted, as the Torah spoke only in response to the evil inclination. And the evil inclination of a priest is as strong as that of an Israelite, right? Meaning, these soldiers, particularly as war was waged in the ancient world, where the primary motivation probably, if you're not like in a siege defending, your city from sure death to all the inhabitants and, the raping and pillaging of the wives, children, etc. If you're going out to war, the soldiers expected to do their looting and raping and pillaging. That's the way they wage war, right? Now, the Torah comes and says the Jewish people are a holy nation. They cannot conduct themselves that way. No way. So what the Torah says is, all right, you go out to war, you win this war, you take a bunch of captives. Okay, so there's a process by which you can have a beautiful woman who is taken captive in that war. But you have to bring her back to your house. You have to let her mourn for her lost father and mother for a month and let her nails grow and cut off her hair so that she looks disgusting to you according to, the visual features of the time. And after you've cooled down for a month, so then you decide, are you going to marry that woman? Wise, right? So they say that the Torah is addressing the evil inclination, meaning soldiers are so filled with the evil inclination when they go out to war. The fog of war makes everyone crazy. That we're going to be realistic about what we're going to, obligate them or prohibit them from doing. So where am I? Right? So where they disagree, so in other words, the Torah spoke in response to the evil inclination. The evil inclination of a priest is as strong as that of an Israelite. So this passage serves to prevent intercourse performed in a prohibited manner, which is relevant to a priest as well as a regular Israelite. So when they disagree, it is with regard to the second act of sexual intercourse. Is a priest permitted to bring the captive into his house, convert her, and marry her? Rav said it is permitted, and Shmuel said it is prohibited. And their reasoning is like this. Rav said it is permitted. Since she was permitted to him once, she remains permitted to him. And Shmuel said it is prohibited, as ultimately she is a convert. And a priest may not marry a convert. Right? That's a different requirement for priests as all other Jews. There are those who say a different version of this dispute. With regard to the second act of intercourse, everyone agrees that it is prohibited, as she is a convert, and a priest may not marry a convert. Where they disagree, it is with regard to the first act of intercourse. Rav said it is permitted because the Torah spoke in response to the evil inclination. And Shmuel said it is prohibited, as any situation that one can read with regard to it, then you shall bring her home to your house. One can also read and fulfill with regard to the earlier command of, and see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you have a desire for her and would take her to you as a wife. Conversely, any situation that one cannot read with regard to it, then you shall bring her home to your house, i.e. the soldier may not marry her, then one does not read regard to it and sees among the captives. And therefore, one may not engage in sexual intercourse with her if he is a priest, right? So even Rav and Shmuel disagree, but you can see the argument that the priests, which are held to a higher standard in all of their lives and everything that they do, they can't become impure for the dead. They have to do everything in a state of purity, etc. That they can't be blemished, so they can serve in the temple. And likewise, if they serve as a soldier going to war, he doesn't have it permitted to him that he can take this beautiful woman who becomes a captive of the army and bring her to his house and have intercourse and marry her. That's what I've got for us today. I apologize that I don't have time for questions today. We've got to rush off. Have a great night. All the best.